All right, so I got another good saying the quiet part out loud story here for you guys, this time coming out of the private weapons manufacturing companies, because on some of their recent calls with investors, they were essentially bragging about and celebrating the recent increased tensions that we have been seeing over in Eastern Europe surrounding Ukraine, as well as the recent bombings that I covered on this channel between the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Yemen. Okay, so we talk a lot on this channel about the perverse nature of the military-industrial complex and the influence that these for-profit weapons manufacturers have over our political system as well as over our military actions. So, even though it kind of sounds conspiratorial maybe to some people who are somewhat apolitical, these types of stories give us an opportunity to just stare at it directly in the face at surface level, because they're basically, again, just bragging to their investors about the potential for a future war that would cost thousands and thousands of civilian lives. So let's just go ahead and get into this. Here from In These Times: top weapons companies boast Ukraine-Russia tensions are a boon for business. Okay, in calls with investors, Raytheon and Lockheed Martin boasted that the worsening conflict is helping profits. Okay, so let's just go ahead and see what they had to say about this. So they say, as the United States weighs more involvement in the growing conflict between Ukraine and Russia, some of the largest weapons companies in the world, Raytheon and Lockheed Martin, are openly telling their investors that tensions between the countries are good for business, and General Dynamics, meanwhile, is boasting about the past returns the company has seen as a result of such disputes. And they say the statements come as the U.S. government escalates arms shipments to Ukraine, and among them, the Javelin missiles that are a joint venture between Raytheon and Lockheed Martin. House Democrats, meanwhile, are trying to quickly push through that bill that I talked about in my video the other day that would significantly increase U.S. military assistance to Ukraine and impose new sanctions on Russia. Okay, so listen, first of all, some of you got to know at base level about the Joe Biden administration is the guy who he nominated to lead the Pentagon, okay, Lloyd Austin, who was a former general himself, then went on to serve as a board member of Raytheon, okay? And then he goes from being a general to being on the board of Raytheon, getting $1 million payout as he leaves Raytheon, to then going and leading the Pentagon. Okay, so, that's the revolving door that we talk about that exists within the entirety of our political system, but especially within the military-industrial complex, okay? Going from the public sector to a private corporation, getting a little bit of a payout, essentially what amounts to be a bribe in effect, and then going back towards these government positions to then control our war industry, basically. So that just in and of itself is a blatant conflict of interest, in my opinion at least. We've seen recent weapon sales to Saudi Arabia specifically that were working in coordination with Raytheon Technologies. So it's it's pretty brazen. It's pretty out in the open. You don't have to do too much digging to see some of that corruption. But unfortunately, it's not just Lloyd Austin, right? It's the entirety of our government, basically, especially the people who make the biggest decisions on these military budgets, the Pentagon budget, and the decisions to take us to war in the first place. And we're going to get to a lot of those other corrupt politicians here in a second, but let's just hear from the CEOs. First, we have from the Raytheon CEO, Greg Hayes, that on January 25th on an earnings call, Hayes included tensions in Eastern Europe among the factors that Raytheon stands to benefit from. And he said, we just have to look to last week where we saw the drone attack in the UAE, which have attacked some of their other facilities. And of course, the tensions in Eastern Europe, the tensions in the South China Sea, all of those things are putting pressure on some of the defense spending over there. So I fully expect we're going to see some benefit from it. So again, when people come out on my channel and my comments, I see it all the time, calling me conspiratorial for suggesting that there is somewhat of a perverse influence from these lobbying groups that have connections with these gigantic for-profit weapons manufacturers that, yeah, maybe they have somewhat of a incentive to get us into some of these conflicts so that they could then stand to benefit from it and profit from our warfare. Okay, it's not really a conspiracy. They're basically just openly saying it to their own investors. Okay, so they make money from the increased likelihood of war. It's pretty much that simple. They get a lot of their money from these government contracts, and they get those contracts especially in tense times like we have right now. So they continue saying that Raytheon isn't alone in its projections, and among those noting the likely boost to its profits is Jim Taiclet, the chairman, president, and CEO of Lockheed Martin, who in a January 25th earnings call told investors, quote, if you look at the evolving evolving threat level and approach that some countries are taking, including North Korea. I don't what threat level increase from North Korea have we seen recently? But Iran, again, not really sure what threat level. We had the United States pull out of the Iran nuclear deal and kind of stab them in the back after they were in full compliance with the guidelines within the Iran nuclear deal. So again, don't really know what increased threat level he's talking about there. If there's an increased threat level in that situation, it's from the United States. But and through some of its proxies in Yemen and elsewhere, and especially Russia today, these days, and China, there's a renewed great power competition that does include national defense and threats to it. So basically, translation, what he's saying here is they are trying to ramp up the rhetoric surrounding Cold War II electric boogaloo, whether it's between the United States and Russia, or the United States and China, or any mixture of them. I guess Iran, you could throw them in the mix there as well. He's basically saying that pushing for a potential World War III or pushing for a new Cold War is going to be highly profitable for them. So again, you see the perverse incentives that exist within these companies. I mean, it's the same thing that we see in many other industries under a capitalist system. We could look at the healthcare industry, where privatized health insurance companies have a direct financial incentive to deny your health insurance claims so that they can increase their profit margins by denying you healthcare. Okay, so it's just in all of these different industries, when you add the profit motive into it, you can start to see some of the disastrous consequences. It just so happens that in the military-industrial complex, that those consequences are like literally increasing the likelihood that we are going to go to war, or increasing the amount of civilian casualties we are going to be seeing in a conflict like the one between Saudi Arabia and the Houthi rebels in Yemen. Okay, we just saw that recent bombing that I covered on this channel, where a Saudi Arabian coalition was bombing basically a migrant detention facility in Yemen, and they end up killing dozens and dozens of innocent people. So those are the types of consequences that are coming from selling governments like Saudi Arabia weapons, or governments like Israel weapons that they then go and use to bomb the Gaza Strip and kill innocent men, women, and children. So it's pretty much the most perverse of all of the industries that exist under our capitalist hellscape of a system that we have here, just because of the nature of war in and of itself. But just to give you guys a little bit of historical perspective on all of this, because the military-industrial complex is something that we have been dealing with for decades and decades and decades, basically at least since World War II, okay? And Dwight D. Eisenhower actually had something to say about this. So let's just talk about this, because he basically was the first guy who used that phrase, the military-industrial complex. So I kind of wanted to give you guys an idea of what he had to say in this famous farewell speech that he was giving. He said, so here from NPR, Ike's warning of the military expansion 50 years later. And they say, on January 17th, 1961, President Dwight D. Eisenhower gave the nation a dire warning about what he described as a threat to democratic government. He called the military-industrial complex a formidable union of defense contractors and the armed forces, and Eisenhower, a retired five-star Army general, the man who led the Allies on D-Day, made the remarks in his farewell speech from the White House. And here's what he had to say. He said, "In the councils of government, we must stand guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex, and the potential for disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist." So basically, he's talking about exactly the same perverse incentives that I was just describing in this last piece over here. But I told you guys that we were going to talk about the actual corruption, like directly, that plays into a lot of how the military-industrial complex gets its way basically through our politicians. And surprise, surprise, just like basically every other aspect of how our political financing of our government officials and their campaigns work, it's basically just at surface level brazen corruption. So we have two different sort of fronts that you can look at this from. Here from Open Secrets is the first one. Senate committee endorses a massive defense spending bill while defense lobbying spending increases. Okay, so translation, I mean, basically what they're saying is the Senate Armed Services Committee, the politicians who get to make the direct decisions about what the military budget is going to be, these people are literally taking direct bribes from these gigantic companies, whether it's Raytheon or Lockheed Martin or General Dynamics, any one of them. They are allowed, for some goddamn reason, to take political donations from those weapons manufacturers and then go sit on committees that make decisions about how much money those those weapons manufacturers are going to get. So again, it's like you don't even have to do too much work here. You don't have to like do any deep digging. It's just like brazen corruption, and it's also just how our entire political system functions essentially. But this is just members of the Senate Armed Service Committee taking bribes. It's not just that though. They don't just get political contributions or lobbying efforts that are spent money to get them to basically give more contract negotiations to these weapons manufacturers, but it's also their own personal financial investments. Okay, here from Business Insider, this is just from December 13th of last year. At least 15 lawmakers who shape U.S. defense policy have investments in military contractors. So again, it's like the corruption is just laughable at this point. Like they're just kind of like spitting in our faces with it. Like they don't even try to do any sort of a guise or hiding it behind any curtains or anything like that. It's like the same motherfuckers who are sitting on the Senate Armed Services Committee, the same motherfuckers who get to vote on all of these war powers and get to vote on the military budgets, they're allowed to simultaneously invest in those same companies that would profit, and therefore they themselves, these politicians, would have a direct financial incentive to increase the military budget, to increase the tensions around the world and the likelihood that we're going to go to war. So again, listen, at the end of the day, the corruption is right there for everybody to see, okay? This is how the entirety of our government works. It's not just with the military-industrial complex. Again, you can go look at the big pharmaceutical industry or the health insurance industry or, any number of other industries. This is what happens when you design your entire political system surrounding campaign contributions from gigantic corporations as if that's, somehow a democratic system. It's not a democratic system. And, these types of CEOs, these types of, executives at these weapons manufacturers, these are the types of people who are actually setting our foreign policy agenda one way or another. Okay, they fund the politicians who then go and take these committee positions. They engage in $100 million lobbying efforts to try to bribe them to take the right positions. So at the end of the day, this is not anything new. We've known that this is how our government has existed in basically since the Dwight D. Eisenhower administration. So it's not anything new. It's not anything surprising, but it is kind of nice to have these CEOs literally come out and directly admit the quiet part out loud.